Well, on the theme of getting away from anything, getting away with anything, I have my getaway car idling in the parking lot. I'm ready. I'm ready to go. Meeting's recorded. Okay, got it. One piece of housekeeping first. I never had a problem with this in my lifetime. I've made a lot of these presentations in this room and the room across the way. But of late, people have said it's a little hard to hear me. So if it's hard to hear me, just move down front and we should be okay. I think we tried to figure out how to use a head mic, but it didn't play well with Zoom, and so we just sort of left it like that. So I think we'll be okay there. So let me do the important stuff here, which is first to share my screen. Share screen. That's like that. That. And it'll put some at the beginning. There. Better view. There we go. I presume the clicker is working. Yes. Okay, great. I've titled this, Jeffrey and I talked about this, how we want to do this, and we sort of came up with this idea. Foundations for Christian Faith, the Existence of God, and taking a look at a survey of the kinds of arguments which have been made for the existence of God in one form or another. Believe me, there have been many, many over the years. Some people count 20, 30, 25 of them, and so forth. So what we're going to do today is we're not going to make you an expert on any of them, but we're going to talk about a lot of them. We're going to take some time to sort of step back a little bit and look at the kind of argument they are, and why one kind of argument differs from another, and why one might have more legs than others, or more suitable in some places. So we'll talk about that a little bit as well. I've got about 60 minutes worth of material. We've got the rest of the night. We've got as many questions and answers. There'll be a couple of stops along the way, so we should be able to do that. So let's with that, let's do some preliminary housekeeping. Since this is a presentation in a seminar on apologetics, let's define a term or two. Apologetics does not tell us what to believe. For that we have separate sources running through God, Jesus, the Holy Spirit, the Bible. It's self-confirmed by the life and words of Jesus. So we should be okay on that front. As I like to say, God has not left us without resources. But in distinction to all other creatures, he's also given us the gift and power of reason. And reason seeks to show that our beliefs are rational. And that's for two reasons. I think our beliefs will be made more accessible to non-believers if their rationality can be demonstrated. And it can comfort and strengthen believers to know that what we believe is indeed rational. But again, and the non-believer needs to know this as well, it's not their rationality which is the ultimate reason for our belief. I like to say that when you accept Jesus, you get a lot of things that come along with that. Virgin birth, and which are just things that we believe because we believe in Scripture. At any rate, so are there proofs for God's existence? Philosopher and apologist J.P. Moreland maintains that any case for God is a cumulative one, and that there are many threads of evidence which, taken together, make the case. We will have reason to revisit this observation during the course of our time today. Those of you old enough to recall the magic 8-ball, right? Remember, one of the famous answers was all signs point to yes, right? That's sort of the way Christian apologetics is. All these signs seem to point in the same direction. So maybe there's a message here that we should sort of extract from this, right? Perhaps just as importantly is the thought that any lack of compelling arguments may simply reflect God's desire for voluntary rather than compelled relationships with us. It is of little value for him for us to feel compelled or coerced into accepting him. And in fact, there's relatively little true proof in our lives. Hard to come by. Once we've left the hallowed halls of mathematics and logic, we're pretty much on our own. With the exception of truths from Scripture, essentially all other truths are contingent. I'll use that word again during the course of our presentation today, but contingent basically means they didn't have to be the way they are. They could have been different, right? Even science is married to the confidence interval. You know, we're 95% confident of this, 75% confident of that, right? Which sets out how sure we are of a particular statement. But I am acutely aware, from personal experience, of the frailty of human reason, which has brought us such wonderful things as Marxism and the French Revolution. Not big triumphs of Western civilization. And how much more so when dealing with a transcendent God, our reason has definite limits. And we'll run up against those limits. We'll see that as we talk. And we all know that even our best arguments will not necessarily convince the unwilling or people who are emotionally or rationally unwilling to accept anything of the kind. So let's look at an agenda. You'll notice that I've included some approximate times. After our current introduction, we'll tackle the three core arguments. We'll start with a brief detour on logical form for arguments and then examine the cosmological, the design, and the moral arguments. Those are kind of the big three. In many ways, this is the core of today's work. We will then visit the modern era and talk briefly about intelligent design, touching lightly on fine-tuning, irreducible complexity, the Cambrian explosion, DNA. And I mean briefly, we're talking 8 minutes, right? This is a short section on an important topic, and Jeffrey may opt to return to it later in the course. We talked about that. He may want to do some more intelligent design stuff before we finish. After that, we're going to go back perhaps 2,300 years to examine Aristotle's argument on the existence of change. This probably is the most challenging part of the agenda, as most of you understandably have little experience in this area. But it's important. Then we'll briefly touch on two other arguments with a long history, the principle of sufficient reason and the ontological argument. But as you can tell from the time devoted to them, it will only be a 50,000-foot flyby. Right? Finally, we will ponder a bit on the types of arguments and that we have seen and consider their strengths and weaknesses. From the time devoted to any one topic, we can't expect to make you into an expert, but our goal here is for you to get some experience with these different types of argumentation, an appreciation of the kind of the inventory that exists when we go looking for evidence for God. In a way, there's something for everyone. So let's start with the three core arguments for the existence of God. From left to right, we have the cosmological argument, which addresses the question of the existence of the universe. We have the design argument, sometimes called the teleological argument. There's always Greek words spread around. I just love it, but most people don't. Telos is for end or purpose, so teleological has to do with ends, which addresses the seemingly obvious design in the universe. That's the design argument in the center there with the DNA helix. And finally, the moral argument, sometimes called the axiological argument, axiological having to do with values, right? That seeks an explanation of our moral sense. You don't need to know those, but if you're looking them up in a dictionary of apologetics, you may see those words and wonder what the heck they are. We say modern form because most of these arguments have a long history and have been approached in different ways. In today's scientific world, there's a marked preference to mount a scientifically oriented defense where possible. This is either a bug or a feature, depending on your perspective. But they are presented here in formal logical form derived from William Lane Craig's 2010 book, On Guard. Anybody familiar with that? Yeah, got it, good. There's also a workbook that goes with it now. If you chose to do that together in a small group, it would be a good way to do that, or just to work through it yourself. And whatever else, this is not an option. One of my favorite cartoons. Skeptics and non-believers need answers to these three questions about why anything exists, why does morality exist, why does the world look like it's designed, right? Why do they even perceive the world to be a moral place? Simply rejecting our answers is not enough. They can't get by with, like I like to call it, a blank pamphlet. Right? They have to have something. So let's move on to formal arguments. We're going to take a look at those because these three arguments are going to be couched in this sort of more formal form. Why formal arguments? There are two important reasons. First is to understand what is being asserted so that we know what we need to either defend or attack, depending on which side of the debate we're on. And second, to allow us to confirm whether the logic is correct. You don't want people putting illogical arguments up in front of you and you're trying to defend against them. You could think of it sort of as an X-ray of an argument. Here's a time-honored example. If all men are mortal and Socrates is a man, then Socrates is moral. We've all heard that before, yes? And those are good premises and good logic, and so that's true. If the first two parts are true, then Socrates is in fact mortal. Now try this one. If all men are immortal and Socrates is a man, then Socrates is immortal. The logic is fine. It's exactly the same as the other one, just the premises aren't true. It's not true that man is immortal. So you have that combination of the form has to be right and the premises have to be correct as well. And the logicians, for some reason, when they get one that has both right, they call it a sound argument, not a valid. Valid means the logic is good, but sound means the logic is good and the premises are correct as well. But let's take this discussion up a notch and talk about what makes the form of the or logic of an argument valid or invalid. Our example this time is if it rains, the streets will be wet. It rained, streets are wet, right? This logic stuff is really good, right? Okay. This is something in the example of if P, then Q, then you affirm that P actually did happen, and then therefore Q must be logically correct. There's another very common form of this, if P, then Q, not Q, therefore not P. So what's that? Well, this is saying if it rains, the streets will be wet. It's saying the streets are not wet, therefore it didn't rain, right? What you can't do is if P, then Q, Q, therefore P, because sometimes when there's P, there's Q, right? Well, there's always the P, there's Q. Sometimes when there's Q, there's P, and sometimes there's not. Maybe the street cleaner went by and wet the street. Maybe there was a heavy dew. Maybe a fire hydrant is leaking. You know why the streets are wet, right? So that's an important thing to remember. But that second one, if P, then Q, not Q, and therefore not P, we will see in the way the moral argument is set up. So let's move on to the first of our three arguments. Oops, let's press the right button too, while we're at it. Cosmological argument. God makes sense of the origin of the universe. Its most common form today is often called the Kalam argument after its Arabic roots, and it goes like this. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. Now, that first statement was seen to be non-controversial. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. But there are objections to it, but they're arcane and beyond the scope of our work today, unless you want to follow me into a discussion of quantum mechanics. Nah, don't want to do that, right? Because supposedly particles pop in and out of existence under certain circumstances, but they're coming from a quantum field and no one really knows what that is. It's too complicated. Suffice it to say that as a general principle, we know of nothing that does not reflect this observation. Things are presumed to have causes, and indeed it would be a strange world if things that began to exist without a cause were a common occurrence. Oh, there's a basketball on the table. Where'd it come from? Well, didn't come from anywhere. No reason for it to be there, right? That's an odd thing. Bill Craig talks about little pink bunnies showing up, popping into existence and running across your field of view and then disappearing, Probably not. But note importantly that we're not saying whatever exists has a cause. Because if you take that line, your non-believer may very well ask you, well, what caused God? And that's a blind alley down which you don't really want to go. Right? So that leads us to the universe began to exist. And if that is true, our logical form would allow us to conclude that the universe has a cause. So if there is a debate, it would seem to focus on whether the universe began to exist or whether it is in some way eternal. And as many of you know, 100 years ago, the universal answer was no, that the universe did not begin to exist, that it was in fact eternal. We had what we call the steady state universe, right? The accepted belief was that the universe did not begin to exist, but was eternal. And then in the 1920s, the astronomer Edwin Hubble and others provided the data and theoretical underpinnings for what came to be called the Big Bang, and soon everything changed. Mind you, at the beginning of the 20th century, in the 1900s, the best astronomic evidence was that the Milky Way, our galaxy, was the entire universe. They saw smudges that their telescopes couldn't resolve, but they thought they were gas clouds or something like that. That's why they couldn't actually bring them into clear focus. And it wasn't until the then the 20s and 30s that they really began to, maybe a little bit earlier than that, began to recognize and get the telescopes which allowed them to single in on that, and suddenly discovered that we weren't alone. We weren't the universe. We were just one place. And today we think there's something on the order of 2 trillion galaxies. It's mind-boggling. I can't even think 2 trillion. Sounds like the national debt. So we need to consider 2 scientific and 1 philosophic point. First is cosmic background radiation. This has been shown to be exactly the heat remnant we would expect from a Big Bang event. Now, Big Bang is not an explosion. I didn't think of Big Bang as the injection of an incomprehensible amount of energy at one time, right? Because there was nothing to explode, right? Think of coming across a campsite and finding the warm embers of last night's fire. Exactly the same thing. That's basically what the background radiation is, only it's the leftover heat from the Big Bang. Here's a composite map made by increasingly sensitive series of satellite investigations. This radiation can be heard, in essence, because it's electromagnetic radiation, just like most other things are, any X-rays and so forth, can be heard by sensitive radio receivers in every direction in the sky. But its heat at about minus 270 degrees Celsius, or 2.76 degrees Kelvin, not that many of you use the Kelvin scale, 0 Kelvin is where all molecular activity stops. So that's cold, right? That's cold. But it's the variations that are important. The scientific community considers this perhaps the most compelling evidence we have for a beginning of the universe, because in these temperature variations, they can actually see the distribution of matter in the universe. And of course, that means the distribution of mass was baked into that initial ignition of the universe, which is really hard to imagine. Our second scientific point is the second law of thermodynamics. The second law is about entropy, which is a measure of disorder. No doubt that can be a confusing term, as we might think we want to measure order, but in fact, the scientists, for whatever reason, measure disorder. It's typically stated this way, that closed systems, meaning systems to which nothing can be added or taken away, like the universe, right, move inevitably from order to disorder. In scientific terms, that's from low entropy, reflecting order, to high entropy, reflecting disorder. Think of a teenager's bedroom, right? Moving from order to disorder, right? The universe is no exception. Now, if the universe were infinitely old, we'd already see it in a highly disordered state, but we don't. There's 200 trillion galaxies out there, and they all seem to have a fairly high degree of order. There still exists an extraordinary amount of order left in it. So if the universe is not infinitely old, then it must be a finite age, and it must have had a beginning. Now, it's really hard to find entropy jokes. That's probably the good, but here's one. It takes a while. Entropy is moving from order to disorder. The further down the thing we get, the more disordered it is. Anyway, the second point is the nature of infinity. So it's a philosophical point, right? The nature of infinity. Infinity is a slippery concept, but we're told that an infinite number of real things is impossible. That comes to us from David Hilbert, one of the greatest mathematicians of the modern era, living in the mid-18th to the mid-19th century. Interesting story about Hilbert, believe that. He said, the infinite is nowhere to be found in reality. It neither exists in nature nor provides a legitimate basis for rational thought. The role that remains for the infinite to play is solely that of an idea. But even if there were such a thing as a real infinity, we are told it would be impossible to count one thing at a time, because you could never reach the end. By the same token, you could never hope to cross an infinite number of time periods like hours or days or years to arrive at today. Yet here we are. So again, the universe must be a finite age, and hence it had a beginning. Now, you don't need to marshal all this scientific and philosophical material to use this argument. All you need is the core argument. You need to remember the bare bones, saying, we believe that whatever begins to exist needs a cause. And that since science now believes that the universe began to exist, it too needs a cause. And as Christians, we believe that cause to be God. What do you believe? And as you ask this, don't forget the atheists, right? They can't weasel out. They need to have an answer. It may be terrible, but they have to have an answer, right? And what might we infer about God from this? If we accept the standard understanding of the Big Bang as the beginning of time and space, then whatever created or caused the universe must precede it and exist outside of time and space. And the implication of that is that since time and space imply matter and change, this being must be immaterial, timeless, and changeless. This is starting to sound a lot like the God of the Judeo-Christian tradition. And if a timeless God existed before the creation of the universe, the creation must have been a decision, in which case this God is personal, because brute matter does not suddenly decide to create. And then, of course, the power needed to create the world is beyond anything else we could imagine. Remember, all the energy that exists in the universe was inserted at one time. Because matter is just congealed energy. That's what E equals mc squared means. If we knew how to harness the power in one of these tables, we could probably heat your house for 6 months. But we don't know how to get it apart. But you got to get down to the atomic stuff. It's hard. It's hard work. But since his will, since he's beyond any conception we have of what it means to be powerful, he's omnipotent. And that's not a bad harvest for a 3-line argument, right? Now, the design argument. God makes sense of design in the universe. The idea that the universe exhibits design is an old one, but it has taken on some new twist. Here's the modern version. The fine-tuning of the universe, which we will defend in a moment, is due to law, chance, or design. Those seem to be the only options. It is not due to law or chance. We'll find ways to rule those out, right? Therefore, it's due to design. So debate focuses on 2 areas. Can we establish the existence of fine-tuning? Can we establish the existence of fine-tuning? And can we eliminate law and chance? So let's look at each of these in turn. Fine-tuning. Our first job here is to define and defend fine-tuning. This means that there are constants of nature, processes, or relationships that must have precisely the values they do for life to exist. Modern recognition of this fact began in the 60s and has accelerated ever since, whether it's the ratio of one of the 4 fundamental forces of nature to another, or the mass of the proton, or the size of the moon. It seems that everywhere we turn, there are things that have to be precisely where they are for us to exist. There's just very little room for variations consistent with the existence of human life. In the interest of time, let's hang our argumentative hat on physicist Paul Davies, himself no theist. Davies has written extensively for both the technical and popular press, and you can see some of his works there on the screen. He has asserted that there is now broad agreement among physicists and cosmologists that the universe is in several respects fine-tuned for life. Now, what they decide to do with that information is another story, but it seems to be fine. It's just the coincidences are too much, right, to accept. So soon the universe is fine-tuned, and if you'd like a fascinating example about fine-tuning of gravity, ask me during Q&A. Right? Now, can we rule out law and chance? Try as they might, the scientific community, which by and large did not at first embrace the concept of fine-tuning, has been unable to show how law could produce the outcomes that we see. Think about it. What we call the laws of nature are descriptions of the nature that we see, but they are not instructions for how to build nature. And these fine-tuned values only became discernible with the inception of the universe. Because before the universe popped into existence, there was nothing for any laws to be about. And that leaves the modern materialist contemplating some kind of laws existing in an immaterial precursor of our universe. Theoreticians hope that some meta-theory of everything, perhaps string theory, would come along and show that the fine-tuned constants and values were in some way required by the structure of nature itself. But so far, that hope has been unrealized. These theories turn out to not only not have unique answers, but some have almost unlimited solutions. No help. But even if there were some higher level that seemed to require the fine-tuning, right? That only pushes the thing up a level. So what caused that? How did that level, which caused the fine-tuning, come into existence? And you're back into one of these, we call it infinite regress. You'll hear me talk about that as we go along. And chance? Chance seems to have come down to the multiverse, that there are supposedly an infinite number of universes so that we can have one which by chance meets the need for our kind of life. Right? Now that's a conjecture for which there is no empirical evidence. And we might add, a grandiose set of universes is a most extravagant use of physical resources. Something called Occam's razor, don't multiply names beyond necessity. Don't invent things you don't have to make something look like it's right. Actually, let's take a slightly different perspective. We do have experience of one universe at least. And amazingly, it's fine-tuned for life. So why don't we follow the one we can see as opposed to inventing a million other ones and say, well, that's we're just one of this big crowd. I don't know. It's because we don't want to go to God. Right? So it's getting easier to put the case for chance to rest. So if the universe is fine-tuned and is not the result of law and chance, then by elimination, it must be design. And the designer of such a place must be unimaginably knowledgeable, so we can add omniscience to our timeless, changeless, immaterial, omnipotent creator we glimpsed in the cosmological argument. The picture seems to be getting clearer. Which brings us to the moral argument. God makes sense of objective moral values. This argument asserts that God makes sense of moral values. Many apologists believe that the moral argument has perhaps the broadest impact and that everyone has access to a moral perspective. We just have to look inside. Remembering, as sign on our bulletin board at home says, why are you looking inside? Aren't you the one who's confused? Right? But fewer people have the interest to follow scientific arguments. So what is it that's so powerful? Here it is in a modern formulation, the formal argument. If God does not exist, objective morals don't exist. But objective morals do exist. Therefore, God exists. Now, logically, you'll note this one is stated a little differently. It's that one that's if P, then Q, not Q, therefore not P. So not P. So Q is objective morals don't exist. So if you do not Q says objective morals do exist, right? And therefore P has been negated. P says God does not exist, therefore P has been negated. Not P, God must exist. So why do we do it that way? Well, you could do it any way you like, but a lot of apologists believe that that initial statement, if God does not exist, objective morals don't exist, is something that you'll get non-believers to agree with. If you say, if God exists, objective moral values exist, they go, oh, don't talk to me about that. I don't want to hear about that. But they can believe that if God does not exist, objective moral values don't exist. So, in fact, I mean, Bill Craig himself, I mean, I've mentioned him a lot. I don't know if you all know who Bill Craig is. He's a double earned degree philosopher who happens to be a member of the church here and teaches a defender's class every Sunday. And he says that this really is almost, this is the argument that people will engage with you more than the sign about whether the universe began to exist or not. So the main point would seem to be, do objective moral values exist? And if so, what are they? And if they exist, then God exists and we're done. So what's the evidence for objective moral values? One important thing to know is that it is generally agreed upon that first, we believe moral values are either subjective in that they depend only on the individual opinion, or objective and that they are independent of individual opinion. Now, when we survey the world, we find wide agreement on moral values. Fairness is good. Murder is wrong. Lying is bad. One apologist said, he was speaking at a university and somebody said, anybody, any Trekkies in here at all? You know who the Ferengi are? The Ferengi, they're this group of people who are itinerant traders and scammers, right? They're liars and scammers and so forth and so on. He said, what about the Ferengi? Their highest value was to lie. And this guy said, oh, how am I going to answer that? So a little prayer. Came and said, well, to lie, you have to know what the truth is, right? Otherwise, you can't lie. That was a good point, right? So it would seem hard to defend subjective morals, right? Or at least if we accepted them, we could only accept them at unthinkable cost to ourselves and to society, because everybody's making up their own rules. That's wrong. You can't do that. Of course I can. I made up my own rules. Right? Now, as much as I might like to delve into this, we could short circuit a long discussion of this if we could simply identify one objective moral value. Because if one exists, then objective moral values exist, and we can go straight to our conclusion. Let me share with you a question that comes from Timothy Keller. He was founder and pastor of Redeemer Church in New York, who very unfortunately passed away not that long ago. Somebody who many of us who know him were very interested in his life and his teachings. I call it Keller's killer question. He used to say, is there anyone anywhere who, regardless of his or her beliefs, is doing something that you think they should stop doing? Oddly enough, in our modern world, which pretends to be so open and resistant to being told that they are wrong, most people answer this in the affirmative, unless, of course, they can see what's coming and don't want to play into your hands, right? So they suspect that you're like an argument for God. But no one who is not mentally ill thinks it's okay to torture babies for fun. but you don't have to be that bizarre. Today's people think it's universally moral to be tolerant in the current meaning of the word, universally moral to not to be a racist. They think there's all sorts of universal morals out there, right? When ISIS was more in the news, I used to show this photograph. Group of young suicide bombers. And indeed, they should stop what they're doing regardless of what they believe, right? So I think we can put this question to bed quickly. Objective moral values appear to exist. But if you're interested, you might go for a deeper discussion. Let me suggest a book called Can We Be Good Without God? I've got a copy up here in my little mini library. Written by a man by the name of Paul Chamberlain, who's a Christian professor of theology and philosophy at a Midwestern university, has written this book about a conflicted judge who assembles representatives of various points of view on moral values for a series of catered luncheons. After agreeing on objective over subjective values, it is both entertaining and informative to see each of the non-God theories attempt to account for objective morals and be found wanting: the moral relativist, the atheist, the evolutionist, the secular humanist. Right? They all have the idea of how we would support the idea of objective moral values. Only the Christian has something which really seems to work. Truly a conversation about truth, morality, culture, and a few other things that matter. So we've satisfied our second premise that objective morality exists. We have arrived once again at God, and now a God is coming into focus who not only is immaterial, timeless, changeless, all-powerful, intelligent, but also the foundation of our moral nature. Really starting to sound like the Judeo-Christian God. But again, the evidence is cumulative, right? You get a little bit from here, and sometimes one piece is stronger from one argument than another, what have you, right? And I would add that the evidence certainly appears to be cumulative and is headed in the right direction. Which brings us to, everybody go. I learned this from a rocket scientist. There was a guy who used to come to Reason to Believe. Jeffrey was talking about the meeting to be there tomorrow night. The guy's coming from Huntsville because NASA has a big Huntsville territory. And he'd give these presentations on some fairly sophisticated stuff, and he'd throw in a slide like this and just cool it, just sit back and cool. But I tell you how, if you want evidence for this of God, that works pretty well, right? Just as a picture, that'd be the aesthetic argument, right? Anyway, the modern era. Intelligence. First of all, any questions on what we've covered so far? I need a sort of liquid here.
Well, there's always the argument that might makes right. Pretty shallow argument, but how would you address that? Might makes right.
Well, first of all, I need to hear a bit more about it. I mean, it might make right only if there are no objective moral values. If you want to live in a world that might make right, well, good for you. There was a Heinlein story that I never could find the reference for it, but they had a place out in the Midwest somewhere in the desert where they put up a force field, like a Star Trek, around it so no one could get out. And when you were convicted of something, you were just sent out there. And there was no law. There was some, food and tools and stuff so you could build a house, but no law, no social services, no nothing. You just had to figure out how to make it work. And if that's where you want to go, that's might make right. And if you want to be there, that'd be great.
Well, it works in the animal.
That's not where I want to live. That's not where I want to live. Except when I was a frat boy.
But if in fact we're merely highly evolved animals.
Right. Sometimes I think not as highly as we think. Sometimes I think not high as we, but that's actually a good question for that book on that, because they talk about the secular humanist and the evolutionist and so forth. They try to explain these things through evolutionary changes, evolutionary biology and not biology, evolutionary psychology and evolutionary sociology and so forth. And none of it seems to work.
Yeah, one other that comes up with some regularity is that morality, that's just socially determined.
Mm-hmm.
None of us has any right to define what's right and true and moral. We do it by consensus.
Right. So there's no possibility of adjudicating a moral decision.
That would be
a problem. And where that we talk about that, it says, you know, if you don't have a standard, right, you can't even tell, say, one society from another. If you say, I've got these two societies, one's a slaveholders and one doesn't have slaves, which one is better? Well, better than what? You know, unless you have a standard, say non-slave holding society is best. Well, then the one that doesn't hold slaves is closer to the ideal than the other. But if not, it's just completely up in the air. There's no moral progress. How could you make moral progress if everything is it's up in the air? It's just you had a different vote. I used to argue with a friend of mine when I first came back to Christianity many years ago, that he said, well, his group sort of decided. I said, well, so what are they going to do? Get together and vote and say for the next month adultery is okay? Is that all right? Right. Well, no, that wouldn't be right. Why wouldn't that be right? And off you.
I would usually respond, how did that work out in Nazi Germany?
Right. Anyway, so anything else from the side? All right,
I have a question, Bruce.
Yeah.
Just elaborate a little bit on the, talking about the fine tuning and looking at the laws of the universe and how the laws describe not how it was built, but that they're here already. I don't know. If you mind elaborating.
Well, if the Big Bang was the beginning of space and time, right, then we could have physical objects in it, right, and there wouldn't have been any physical objects before that, right? We need all those things to have physical objects. And so if you wanted to discover that force equals mass times acceleration, which is Newton's famous law, you had to have something that was subject to forces and in order to see it, because all the laws are now in the modern world mathematical abstractions from what we see in real life, which is another reason I didn't mention this, but it's another reason why they wouldn't be very good for telling you how to build things, because they abstract out a lot of things. You know, it's like the economist said, well, we'll forget about transaction costs. And the guy doing time and motion studies, you know, in physics says, well, we'll ignore friction, right? Well, that's how the real world works, right? So that stuff wouldn't be there. That was it. So it's really hard to think. We tend to think it's because of the law that somehow it's going to make something happen, but it's not. They're really just descriptive. It comes right down to it, right? Okay. Intelligent design. First, some background. Intelligent design arguments have a number of roots, but one very important one began fairly recently as a challenge to Darwinism and its assertion of chance, Darwin's assertion of chance alone in the development of species, even though Darwin had little idea of what the driving mechanism might be, what caused you to have these chance developments of things. Many of his earliest and most ardent supporters came on board because they were more attracted to Darwin's usefulness against religion than they were on his impact in biology. If you really want to know, I have a full presentation on that. And while there have been challenges to Darwinism right from its inception, one of the readers of one of the publishing houses who was given the manuscript said, don't publish this. It's full of nothing but speculation. And, you know, whatever. He said it was like asking for a judgment when you hadn't presented evidence to the jury. But starting in the 1980s, a new strain of challenges arose with the advent of the intelligent design movement. And today, although we're going to be extraordinarily brief, I said earlier, Jeffrey may want to go back to that a little bit later. So let's look at some of those. Fine tuning. Well, we've talked about fine tuning already, but that's a major issue. And the list is up to, I don't know, Eric could tell us, but 150 or 200 things or whatever that just unbelievable, that have to be exactly the way they are. And the more we look, the more things we find that just have to be that way. And how unusual our situation is. Right? Even just the moon is very unusual to have a satellite that close and that regular and all of that. It's responsible for all kinds of things and climate issues and oceanic issues and so forth. We would be lost without it. As I said earlier, some level of fine tuning is widely accepted in the scientific community, even if the implications for design are still resisted, some level. So even Paul Davies, I mentioned before, says the majority of people are not. It's becoming more and more common in the scientific community to accept fine tuning, but they don't accept the implications of it. Let's go to irreducible complexity. This focuses on Darwin's claim that if any biological component could not be shown to arise from incremental small steps, accumulating over time, that my theory would absolutely break down. Well, we now have multiple examples of this. Professor Michael Behe wrote Darwin's Black Box in 1998, showing both through a molecular machine, the bacterial flagellum, and the complexity of the blood clotting system shared by most mammals, that this incremental buildup was inconceivable. These biological components were, in effect, irreducibly complex. They only had valuable function if all their parts were in place and could not wait for them to be assembled bit by bit over long periods of time, as Darwin seems to require. So the issue about the blood clotting, it's a cascade of about 25 proteins and enzymes and so forth and so on, which first have to identify where there's been a wound and get the message, and then they got to rush the right thing to the right place. And then they've got to create the fibrins and so forth and create the clot and stop the thing from bleeding. And then after a period of time, they have to disassemble it, because you don't want to be in, if it stopped the blood flow to your hand, you don't want to be there forever, and end up your finger falls off, so you have to have that end. So you can't have 2/3 of a blood clotting mechanism, because you'd all die from it, right? And we don't know when to wait, or how long are we going to wait around until we get the other part, So that was the idea of irreducible complexity. And since that time, since Behe's time in the late 90s, many other molecular machines have been added to the evidence. And put simply, these systems showed that you had to know the end before you even know where to begin in creating some of these biological capabilities. And that, of course, screamed intelligence rather than chance. Anybody for design? Your argument? The Cambrian fossil record. Darwinism asserts a steady progression of forms through the fossil record. There are, in fact, very few fossil series that truly can be said to confirm the evolutionary model, much less the arrival of new species. Knowledgeable observers have noted that we appear to have fewer candidates for so-called transitional forms today than we did in Darwin's day. They've been found not to be transitional forms. And while Darwin expected to find fossils for everything, the predecessors of most, if not all, animals, at the base of the fossil record, in the Cambrian period, 500 million years ago, there suddenly burst onto the scene the majority of the animal phyla, which is the first taxonomic category below kingdom, which is the highest. So it's a very high level, right? These included animals with widely varying body forms, such as spinal cords, or arthropods like cockroaches and lobsters, with outside hard shell bodies, and jellyfish with radial symmetry, and there's all sorts of stuff like that. The majority of these phyla remain with us today. Like 23 phyla showed up, but we still have 16 of them around. Right? That they appear to what geologists would call a geological instant seems incredible. Now, when you look at a geological layer, you can't get down to 5 minutes or 10 minutes. You get down to 100,000 years or 500,000 years or whatever. But let's say like that, that's a geological instant where we talk about from the evolutionary perspective. And to date, we find no serious hint of evolutionary predecessors. You'd be surprised to know I have a presentation on that as well. So design, anyone? Good. But in conclusion, let's turn to a different kind of argument, DNA. For the most recent and compelling indication of intelligent design comes to us through DNA. Once it was decoded and its role in biology of life was better understood, it turned out to be not only pure information, but information of a very particular type called complex specified information. What the heck is that? We owe this definition to William Dembski. It was that second picture on the front page of this section, who has a PhD in math and a PhD in philosophy and a master's in divinity. It's pretty cool. The easiest way to understand this term, to me, is that complex specified information is both complex, which is a term subject to mathematical definition, right, and reflects a standard outside of itself. So, for example, anything written in a natural language could qualify because language is notoriously complex, and because it reflects the external standards of spelling, grammar, syntax, of which the creator of the message had to have prior knowledge before the message could ever be created. This is a somewhat technical description of something that we would do instantly many times over. If you compare patterns of sand on the beach of the waves, that make those little nice little ripples, and then there's a heart, John loves Mary in the middle of it, right? You will immediately see one as a result of unthinking natural processes and the other as a human construction bearing the obvious marks of intelligence and design. And so the DNA argument asserts that complex specified information is always found as the product of intelligence. In fact, we have never found anything remotely looking like complex specified information that was not the product of human intelligence. Hence, in DNA, the billions of letters in precisely the right sequence to guide the manufacture of proteins must have an intelligent origin. You'd be surprised to know that I have a full presentation on that too. We'd be here all night, all week. Note that this does not necessarily result in God. It just says intelligence, right, to do these things. I'm always mystified that many scientists are assured that we would recognize an intelligent signal coming from outer space. Anybody see Contact? Jodie Foster years ago. It's like the last movie I ever saw. But they can look inside almost every cell in our body and find an Encyclopedia Britannica of intricately structured information, and yet blithely assume that it all came about by chance. So once again, design anybody? Right? But now how about some reflections on ID arguments? Very quickly, much of ID is not expressed in typical formal arguments we saw in our first three today. It often serves, as J.P. Moreland says, as increasingly cumulative inferences to intelligence, and hence most likely to God. Interestingly enough, though, it's the DNA argument which has been most closely structured in formal terms, using a kind of logic called inference to the best explanation, also called in your philosophy text adduction. You gather the evidence and then examine competing explanations, and what moves us toward one particular explanation as opposed to another is both its breadth of coverage of the facts at issue and its explanatory power, often identified by its simplicity. Darwin himself used this kind of reasoning, so it's interesting to see it turned to use by critics of his theory. Right? So that you can't do that. Yes, we can. Well, Darwin did it. Right? Now, what about Darwin? He did. I'm sure you know the blowback against ID that ID has received from the Darwinist priesthood, and I use the term intentionally, has been unrelenting. Still, ID continues to make progress in public recognition. One common accusation is that ID is not science. That is something called the demarcation problem, and none other than Bill Craig will tell you that the philosophy of science is where questions as to what is and is not science need to be adjudicated, not by scientists themselves. And in fact, philosophers in that field have lost interest in the question because, at least where it comes to ID and evolution, let's say, because there seems to be no line that can be drawn that puts evolution in as science and ID out. They're either both in or both out. So the ground such critics stand on is weak and weakening, but don't expect Wikipedia to recognize that. They persist in referring to ID as pseudoscience. So for one more time, I'll take design. Another. Wait, sound of music territory. The hills are alive. I had a chance to visit there, but I was very young. I was interested in the fact that I could buy beer. But it's absolutely beautiful. And if you want an argument for God, I mean, that's absolutely incredible. But we're going to have, any questions on ID? Okay, all right. We're going to have to leave this behind and journey back almost 2,300 years to take on classical arguments, Aristotle in a very different form of argument. This is your little 15 minutes of heavy lifting. Okay. We'll start with metaphysics. That's enough to put most people off. Bill Craig wrote a book with J.P. Moreland called Philosophical Foundations for Christian Worldview. And in this section on metaphysics, the first line says, metaphysics has a public relations problem. A lot of people think it's in the Shirley MacLaine section of the bookstore. It's not. It's not. So what exactly is metaphysics? It's nothing less than the study of reality. And before you object that that's the role of science, realize that science today willingly restricts itself to the study of material things. If there are immaterial things in the world, consciousness, free will, love, I mean, there's lots of stuff that might be immaterial in the world, which of course hardcore materials will deny. We will need to study them through metaphysics, as metaphysics addresses all of reality. So if we were to ask questions like, how does existing and non-existing differ? Is reality one or many? Are abstract objects, things like numbers and propositions, are they real? Like, the Pythagorean theorem. Suppose everybody who existed forgot about it, and there were no more right triangles after the Russian bomb went off, right? Does that mean the Pythagorean theorem wouldn't be true? I think it would still be true. So where is it true? You know, it's an abstract object, right? Interesting questions, if you're that kind of person. Are we free or are we determined? I'm not going to answer any of these tonight, all right? But if we want to ask questions like that, we have to cast our lot with the metaphysicians. Metaphysics is a long-standing division of philosophy. Though it began with the Greeks, it was often associated with the medieval period, during which time much productive work was done in and around the 13th century, with the work of Thomas Aquinas and others. Its power and careful reasoning were such that all early universities were founded on metaphysics, which was applied to many different fields we would not necessarily identify today with philosophy. You might be surprised that that included science, right? It was a metaphysical operation because it took in all of reality. Right? To get an understanding of it, nothing helps like doing so. And that will involve taking on some new vocabulary and some new concepts. So we're going to start by taking on board a few basics of Aristotelian metaphysics to see what they were driving at and how it led them to God. And just understand, this brief overview will not substitute for a more careful study of this rich topic and is not necessarily complete enough to convince you of its value in the here and now. My goal is to give you a taste of what this kind of reasoning is like, because as we finish today, we will want to be comparing and contrasting various approaches to evidence. And this is a very important one that needs to be in that mix, right? Our first stop will be with the concepts of actuality and potentiality. Yes.
I wonder if we could go back to that other slide. It said, are we free or are we determined? Can you explain a little bit what that is
You'll see in my, when we move to Q&A, you'll see that I do Q, I don't do A's. Hey, you're on your own for the A's. No, and that's
You lost.
okay. I do Q and yeah. Yeah, you don't want too many A's. You get in trouble with A's, right? I could be press secretary. She never says anything, right? Just word salad. No, those are typical questions from metaphysics. They're not going to concern us today. They were just there for an example to give people an idea what was a typical thing that metaphysics might address, other than its scientific world, right? That's all. I don't mean to be right. Yeah. Right. So, actuality and potentiality. One aspect of reality that has fascinated philosophers is the observation that things change. That seems simple enough. But what does it actually mean? As the philosophers are like, they can't leave well enough alone. Has the thing that was changed now gone out of existence? Has something new come into existence? Or is there some way to view change as separate from the underlying thing that continues to exist? Virtually everything in our experience is always changing. Green leaves turn colors. Ice cubes melt. The chair is painted red. A child grows into an adult. If nothing else, everything is getting older, right? Is there some way to make sense of all of these things? There's potentially infinite number of examples that will allow us to see both the change and the continuity. That seems like a surprisingly difficult question to me. But perhaps surprisingly, the answer is yes. Aristotle proposed that things are substances, and that they could take on properties like being red or round or hard or frozen, right? And whatever something is, whatever current properties it has, a substance is said to have them in actuality. The things that it actually has right now. But that's in contrast to the characteristics it could have, which it has in potentiality. So to use my favorite example, an ice cube is in fact actually frozen, but it has the potential to melt. It does not have the potential to run around the block, or as my favorite philosophers say, or to break into song, or to smell like lilacs, right? But it does have the potential to melt. On this view, we can see that together, actuality and potentiality, in effect, define the essence of a substance. You know, what's it like? Well, what's it like right now? And what could we really realistically see it being under certain circumstances? It's a child. Well, yeah, but I know that could be an adult one day. I got that. That's an acorn, right? Could be an oak tree. I know all these things. I know the potential that's involved in things. If someone says that's an ice cube, I say, I'll melt it with my hairdryer there. Well, it won't ever melt. It never melts. Well, I'm not so sure it's an ice cube. Doesn't behave in an ice cubey like fashion to me, right? Think of an object's essence as the inventory of things that it typically is at some moment, joined by those things that it could realistically become. And I think you would all agree that to say you know something entails knowing what it is as well as what it could be in the natural course of affairs, to really have a full understanding of what it is. And of course, it is just that process of becoming that we call change. So according to Aristotle, change is potentiality becoming actuality, right? So the ice cube has the potential to be a puddle, and it can be made into a puddle by heat, for example. By the way, congratulations, you've just done your first metaphysics. Now, let's see where this leads us. Moving from potentiality to actuality. Now, according to Aristotle, potentials cannot actualize themselves, right? But are brought into being by something which is already actual. Something which has the power to affect the change in question. Thus, the actuality of heat will cause the change in the ice cube, but not if it doesn't have the potential to melt, right? When you point your hot air dryer at the ice cube, you have certain expectations. First, that it will melt, but almost certainly that it will not break into song. In these expectations, you are recognizing the importance of the inventory of its potential states. The ice cube has the potential to be a puddle of water, and the introduction of the actuality of heat will make that a reality. Now, according to this view of reality, potentiality has another characteristic. It cannot exist on its own, but is always found in conjunction with something that already has actuality. In any case, it would be hard to imagine what pure potentiality might be. Although, again, the quantum world is giving us some ideas. But while potentiality is always mixed with actuality, by contrast, the Greeks reasoned that actuality can exist on its own, by itself. May not exist that way most times, but it can. This will be very important to us. This is a longer digression, longer digression than we can afford, but you will see the value of it very shortly. So on to two further distinctions, chains of causation. Now here's a sentence in metaphysics speak. If actualities bring about changes in realizing the potentials inherent in substances, right, there could be chains of such causation. You got that? No? I mean, everything is either an actuality or potentiality, and actualities can turn potentials into actuality, right? So the heat, which has the hair dryer, which has the actuality of heat, can turn an ice cube into a puddle because it will actualize its potential puddleness. If actualities bring about changes by realizing the potentials inherent in substances, there could certainly be chains of such causation. A causes B, which in turn causes C, and so on. Now, Greeks identified two types of such chains, of course, right, called essential, which occur simultaneously, and accidental, which occur across time. But there's one more critical distinction differentiating these two chains of causation, and that's how the individual causes of this chain of causation, A affects B, affects C, affects D, how those are related one to the other. Let's take essential causation first. These are causes that occur simultaneously. If one ceases, they all cease. They must remain active for the result to be produced. Now, the time-honored example is a hand pushing a stick, which is pushing a rock. Here's the only relevant picture I could find, right? Warning, it's not perfect because the puck ultimately glides away as if under its own power, but that's irrelevant to my example. But while that first initial push is going on, right, the hand does the stick, which does the rock, or in this case, the puck, right? What is crucial here is that, at least at first, the rock moves only so long as the stick moves, and the stick moves only so long as the hand moves. Now we can trace that back further to the muscles in the pusher and then to the neurological activity needed to evoke the muscles and all those kinds of things. But there's no need to do that for our purposes. It's sufficient to understand that all of these activities have to be happening in concert for the stone to move, and that as soon as any step ceases its activity, the entire series stops. Right? If you prefer, here are two different but effective analogies, I think. First, think of music, live music, lasting only so long as the performer consents to play, right? You stop blowing on the horn and you're done, right? The second is to think of your dead battery laptop plugged into an extension cord. Nothing happens until the extension cord is plugged into the power source. You could have 5 extension cords. If it's not plugged into the power source, nothing's going to happen. Right? That's along the lines of essential causation. Each step's power derives from the prior step. The hand puts the power into the stick puts the power into the rock. But the muscles before that had put the power into the hand. Neurological activity had changed the muscles to do it like that. If each prior steps need to be actualized, right, to get it to work, like sort of turned on, if you will, each step, there's no end. Because each time you go down, you need something which itself needs to be actualized to put its power into this chain of events, right?
Bruce, can I go back to this question about if one ceases, they all cease? In your example, trying to understand it.
Right.
When that guy pushes that stone, and he ceased pushing that stone is still going.
Yeah, well, I said at the beginning, this is not a good example in that sense, because the stone can take off by itself. I'm only concerned with the actual.
Okay.
I couldn't find a picture of a hand with a stone on a driveway pushing it along. Or rather, I gave up. But you're absolutely right. That's right. Analogies are really tricky things.
Yeah, okay.
Right. At any rate, each step's power derives from the power of the prior step. The stick has no relevant power unless being provided by the hand, and the same with the stone, which must continuously receive power from the stick. But please note something critical. Each step that has the potential to function as a member in this chain has to be actualized itself to start, because the stick needs to be actualized by the power given to it by the hand, right, to get it to participate. Otherwise, it's just going to lie on the ground, right? Pick it up and move it, right? The stick doesn't just start to push. It is actualized by something prior, in this case, the hand. But if each prior step needs to be actualized, there's no end. No. If we think it needs to go down and deeper, one or another. But that seems impossible. So the chain must have a first member, not requiring actualization. In a sense, when you finally plug that laptop extension into the wall. Right? Now, there's a lot of stuff has to go on to get the power to the wall. I got it. But if that's the source of power, then we're okay from that point, right? So there must be a first step, and that first step does not need to be actualized. And the Greeks called this pure actuality. Right? Now, right, hold that thought, right? Accidental causation, that continuous link passing the power on from participant to participant, is not present. Subsequent steps are independent of all prior steps. To illustrate, think of a succession of a family. The grandfather has a son, and then sometime later, completely independently of any current grandfatherly involvement, the son has a grandson. There's no doubt that the second birth did not require any direct involvement by the grandfather. Indeed, he did not even need to be alive. And while the grandfather's activity made the chain possible, in no way can we say that he had any part in actually creating it. He's gone, maybe. The son had all the power he needed to accomplish the change he initiated. This is why we say that accidental causation can be traced back across time, and we have no idea to where that change may have begun. Now, putting that all together. Just to recap, here's a visual presentation. Accidental or linear causation are shown as separate arrows, as these arrows have breaks between them but are related across time. There's no connection between them necessarily. Once one change takes place in the first arrow, the next may or may not take place, and that's not in the power of the original change to direct that to take place, like it is in the essential set. But in essential causation, all the arrows are connected. And though the diagram suggests that each vertical change exists in an isolated slice of time, in fact, these changes can and do persist over time, providing the whatever with the same set of component parts, hand, stick, stone, whatever, they can persist over time, right? So if that's creating something, a moving stick, a moving stone, right? As long as you keep doing it, it'll all those things will continue in place to keep that moving. This is particularly true when we consider, as we will in a moment, their importance in providing not just for the characteristics of something, that it is red or round or frozen, but how about for the very existence and persistence of things, both living and non-living. It seems that every component in the accidental chain is brought into current and continuous existence by an essential causal chain. Well, let's try to cash that out. We're going to go big. Use a modern example. Physics recognizes 4 forces in nature, from the weakest to the strongest: their gravity, the weak nuclear force, electromagnetic force, and the strong nuclear force. Strong nuclear force, whether you've heard of them or not, they're all critically important to existence of life and non-life. But the most pervasive is the strong nuclear force because it holds atoms together. Without the strong nuclear force, no atoms. Could there be anything more fundamental to reality than that? And well, you might ask, what would happen if the force stopped? It's actually quite simple. Presumably everything in the universe would instantaneously decompose into subcomponents of atoms. Preventing that catastrophic event would seem to be the most important job one for something called essential causation, continuously providing the power of the strong nuclear force. Think of it this way. Here's our universe before, with essential causation contributing the strong nuclear force, doing its part to hold everything together. Galaxies and all sides of stuff out there, local groups and the whole thing, right? The power is on. If you turn that power off, that's what you have. That's a big difference. On, off. And I'm struck that in Revelation 6:14 says, the sky vanished like a scroll that is being rolled up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. So now we have some idea how God would do that. He would simply revoke the strong nuclear force. Of course, the Greeks knew nothing about the forces of nature in that sense. They knew nothing about them, but that's really it. Because we need that. That has to be continuously supplied to you to exist, and to this table, and this wall. Everything has to be kept in place by this force, right? So let's summarize. Here's our universe. Let's summarize. Essential chains of causation only exist by the power that they get from their first member. Like you finally plug the 5th extension cord into the socket. Now you got the power, right? They continue only so long as the first member continues to power them. That first member cannot need something prior to actualize it, or we'd be on our way to an infinite regress. We'll never find an end to that set. Hence, that first member is considered to be, in Aristotelian terms, pure actuality. The Greeks called it the unmoved mover, where move was taken to mean change, and so the beginning was an unchanged changer. And along with the Greeks, we call that God. So what might a being of pure actuality be like? Pure actuality is without potential. Remember, everything's either actuality or a combination of actuality and potentiality. So it's without potentiality. If you have no potentiality, you don't change, because change is bringing some potential into actuality, right? So it's changeless. Changeless implies outside of space and time, both notoriously connected with change. So this being is both eternal and immaterial. We've heard these before in the other one there, right? If this being were imperfect in some way, it would have inactivated potentiality, but it does not, hence it is perfect. If this being is perfect, it would not be missing anything, and hence it must be fully good. And since the source of all power is resident in this being of pure actuality, it's omnipotent. And if such a being cannot not know something, we believe is omniscient. And here's finally something we haven't encountered yet, and I love this. There could not be two such beings, since there would have to be a difference between them in order for us to tell them apart. One has something the other does not. But a being of pure actuality lacks nothing. So there cannot be two of them. And hence, we have reasoned our way to monotheism. To my mind, that's not a bad return on our investment in a few metaphysical definitions and principles. All right. Jeff, we're about 10 minutes to 8. Should we just do a Q&A and call it quits?
Well, we could open it up and if there's a lot of feedback.
Well, let me scoot forward and show you something that I think would be. There were two other principle of sufficient reason. It said that means everything has to have a cause, and so there's contingent causes and necessary causes, and just like with the pure actuality thing, you've got to get down to something which is pure actuality and not commingled with potential. If you have contingent explanation, you've got to get to a necessary explanation somewhere. Right? Otherwise, it goes on forever. And that necessary explanation, of course, is God. That's the principle of sufficient reason. Oh, and then you got to hear this one. This is fun. One more thing. The ontological argument, that's confounded most people for a bazillion years, came in from the 1000s. Ontology is a study of being of existence. The argument is God is the greatest of all conceivable beings. That's the proposal. You could argue about that. But we think as Christians that God is the greatest of all conceivable beings. If we could conceive of a being that was greater than God, then that's what God would be like. Right? If you can conceive of a greater being, that would be God. But think about the concept of non-existence, right? The potential for non-existence, and ask, which is greater, a God whose non-existence is conceivable or a God whose non-existence is inconceivable, right? Why, the latter, of course, that's the greater being, is the one whose non-existence is inconceivable. Therefore, God exists. As my old math teacher said, QED, quod erat demonstrandum. That's the proof. Because his non-existence is inconceivable. Bill Craig says that's been around. That's still argued in some philosophy departments about it. There's all sorts of theses. It's a long history, but that's a real fun one. Thoughts on different types of arguments. Scientific arguments concern empirical things that you could, get through your senses, right? Out through the senses. Such things are contingent and inherently probabilistic. There are not a lot of necessary things in the world. Mathematics, scriptural truth, not a lot of things which are absolutely necessary. And scientific arguments are always at the risk of new contradicting data. Suppose they find, we talk about intelligent design, and irreducible complexity, or DNA, and said that we've never seen this complex specified information as coming from a source other than the intelligent source. Suppose we found something. I don't know what it would be like, but if we found it, that argument collapses like that, just gone, because there's the counterexample. Right? Mathematical arguments concern rational things found in the mind. When you do geometry with a triangle, you're not doing it with the triangle drawn on your page, because the line may not connect quite the right, the angles may not be exactly right. It's an approximation of a triangle. You're doing it with a mathematical concept of a triangle, exactly what it is, with lines which have no mass and points that have no dimension, and so forth. It's a rational thing that you're doing. It concerns rational things found in the mind. Now, there are things that look like it found in nature and so forth, but that's not what you do geometry with. Results of careful argumentation are necessarily true. Well, we got it finally. You apply the postulates correctly, and you get to the end of the theorem, and you prove that something is either right or wrong, and it's true. There's no I don't think so. I don't agree with that. Right? And then the metaphysical arguments, which you just saw an example of, they concern empirical. They kind of mix the two. They concern empirical observations, such like things change. I think that's really hard to argue against. I mean, things change. What's going to change about that, right? But of such generality that they cannot successfully be challenged, and they apply conceptual premises like potentiality and actuality, and the fact that actuality can bring this potentiality into being. And if you think about those, how would these things be organized? They'd be organized in accidental causes that don't have direct relationships with each other, and in essential causes which consistently have that same relationship, right? And must have a first member, and direct us toward necessity. So the question for well, withdraw from this. Whoops, time for Q&A. Well, here's my, Richard, this is for you. Time for Q&A, or at least some Q.
I've run out of questions.
Okay. Well, isn't that funny? Because I've run out of answers. But anyway, the point is that these metaphysical arguments have been around for 2,000 years. And there was a man by the name of Edward Feser, who was a professor of philosophy out of California College. Don has had some introduction to him. And he was an atheist teaching in a university. And he'd teach these scholastic truths, these scholastic proofs. And he said, like we all did, you get a barrel of water, throw the proofs in, shoot them, and tell them all the things why they don't work, and move on. And he said, I kept doing this. And one day he had to do an introductory philosophy class and a religion class. And said, maybe I could figure out a way to make this more interesting. So he started to read about it a little bit. So he'd make it a bit more interesting. But that didn't convince him. The more he taught it, the more I said, wait a minute, these are more than interesting. This makes a lot of sense, until finally it's true, right? It dawned on him that this was true. He's now a practicing Catholic of all things. But anyway, I mean, unbelievably, he literally philosophized himself into belief. But that's one of Aquinas's famous ones, drawn from Aristotle. There were 5 that Aquinas did on different things, like some change or whatever. And that's a whole interesting study all by itself. But they're really very interesting, and they're going out. There's a kind of a little revolution going on, very small, in some philosophy departments who are looking at this we call scholastic metaphysics, and thinking that there are things that we find difficult to understand and explain in the modern world, which would be much more easy to understand if we looked at it from this kind of perspective. So one issue, of course, is the fact that there are things which are immaterial. There are people out there called eliminative materialists who say if you can't find something with your voltmeter, it's my sort of way of saying it, if you can't find it with your voltmeter, it doesn't exist. Oh, you look for free will, you couldn't find it with your voltmeter. Well, it doesn't exist. You look for consciousness, you couldn't find it with your voltmeter. It doesn't exist, right? Because they're so embedded in this materialistic view that everything has to be material. Nothing can be immaterial, right? Everything has to be natural as opposed to supernatural. I don't mean like Halloween or anything, just outside of the physical reality of nature. And that we would be better off if we hadn't thrown all this stuff out in the 1500s, when we found out that we could mathematicize the physical relations of things, right? So like force equals mass times acceleration, we could do that. And we could use that to help control nature. That was heady stuff. So we looked at all this Greek stuff and said, well, we don't need that. And the Greek science was weird. The Greek philosophy was good. The Greek science was weird. They had the earth in the center, and they had globes going around with the stars on them and stuff. They were white to sell that, but they threw the baby out with the bath. And they threw out purpose and basically meaning. Right? And so today we're stuck. We have all these problems. We can't answer these problems. We can't understand how the mind and body work together. But you can understand a lot better through this, because it's not a lot of steps to get to the immortality of the soul and the validity of natural law. It'd be nice if we thought that natural law was valid in our society today. That would be a big step in the right direction. Right. So we lost a lot, and hopefully we're trying to gain some of this. And this is about, everything that begins to exist has a cause. In quantum theory, they have this idea of the wave function, because you can't pin down a particle. As soon as you try to look at a particle, then you can see its velocity, but you can't see its position, or you can see its position, but you can't see its velocity, or all sorts of crazy things, right? And we can't cash this out in sort of real terms, right? But oddly enough, this talked about potentiality, and that's what those things are. That's what those waveforms, they're potentiality, and something happens. If you know Schrodinger's cat, you open the box and the cat's either alive or dead. If something actually happens, you can see it. But that probability is we can't put our hands on it, because we don't know how to. We can't talk to people in real terms about it. And there may be some way of doing that, which would be very helpful to us as a society. Right? Anyway. We have 30 seconds left.
Yeah, that argument for pure actuality, which, as you summarized, concludes with the reality of monotheism. And it seems quite obvious that one rather pathetic argument against that is why are they dead?
Mhm.
And another is, what about the evil in the world? There must be two gods, not one.
Yeah.
Because there is goodness, but there's also horrible evil. So doesn't that, again, these are fairly easily answered.
Right. Well, usually that one is that we see evil as the absence of good. It's called a privation. Right. So if you're blind, you're deprived of the actuality of sight. Right. This potentiality, I think, is very complicated. Like, I may have the potential to learn languages. So technically I have the potentiality to learn Greek. So I really do have several steps removed the potentiality to speak Greek. But I'm nowhere near there yet. A lot of stuff has to happen before I can ever get there. So these different layers of potentiality. But what I was going to say something I thought which was important. Now I've forgotten it. You talked about the monotheism. I know what it is. Monotheism.
Yeah.
We talk about there can't be two of them. This is something people don't get. Leibniz, great philosopher in the 18th century, had a law called Leibniz's law of the indiscernibility of identicals. The only thing you can't discern between are things that are identical. But identical doesn't mean what you think it means. It doesn't mean like identical twins. It doesn't mean like if I take two chairs and put them out here, so they're identical. No, they're not, because this one's here and that one's there, right? So there are differences in them, right? And that's why we say there can't be two of these beings of pure actuality, because there have to be some difference between them so we can tell them apart. But they're all pure actuality. They all have God has the ability to do anything, right? And that's what it means to be a being of pure actuality. And if some other thing did, then we'd have to say, well, what's the difference between them? Well, there's no difference between them, because unless one of them is missing something, in which case it's not back to the ontological argument. The greatest one is the one with all the actuality instead of 99.99% of it, whatever. So it bears a lot of thinking, some of this stuff, and it brings us down. I think in the modern world, we have lost any kind of gut feeling about the role of God in the continuation of the universe. We pay lip service to it. Everything is in your hand, and we do, but we don't really, from moment to moment, that turn the switch off and we go from universe to black, right? Nothing. So thank you for your patience.
Bruce,
Hang on.
this is
Yeah.
Jay. I really appreciate your presentation. It was great. I have a little bit of difficulty following at the second half when you start to talk about Aristotle. So is it possible for you to make it available as a handout to the people?
Andrea sent around email just the other Monday or Tuesday, something like that, which had Monday, which had a link to the handouts. If you don't see them, please get it. If you don't see that in your email, first of all, we need to get you on that email list. And yes, I have it there. I don't know.
Okay. I didn't get that. If Andrea can send it to me, I would appreciate it.
Okay.
Do you get regular weekly announcements, Jay?
From Millie?
No, it would come
Andrea.
from Andrea.
No, I don't get anything
From
from Andrea.
from the Areopagus.
No, I get weekly from Millie, but not from Areopagus.
Okay.
I get specifics
Okay,
about this.
I'll check it. I'll check it, but
Okay.
that's, yeah,
If you can send it to me, that'll be a big help to me. Thank you.
I'll make sure that you're on the list, Jay.
Okay, thank you.
Would you make sure that
Mhm.
list goes out, Andrea? Would you make sure that goes out with that document on it? Okay. All right. Perfect.
All right, very
All right,
good.
everybody.
Very good.
I believe.
Now, we had, Agape, Emmanuel back here, and she had to leave. As you know, she was going in for extremely serious surgery. I never asked her specifically what it was, but it sounded extremely critical. And her surgery was postponed because when she went in prior to the surgery, her blood pressure level was sky high. And so she, she needed to leave. But let's be sure and pray for her before we leave. Is there anything else that we need to share about Agape?
She has a son that, he loves to come and go to his class and everything, 16. And, he really could use a car that, so just pray that they can find something that